The market is open and I could be making money right now, but instead I'm making a video about antinatalism for some reason. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Kojima Powered, and thank you very much for joining me. In this video, I'm going to examine if antinatalism is a reasonable philosophy. Now, it's been debated otherwise, but it's disingenuous to frame antinatalism solely as a net value equation in order to leverage an argument. A number of integral factors have been adduced in support of this philosophy. Some of these factors entail various ethical foundations, the nature of value, and moral relativism. So, let me stop right there. Moral absolutes are so contextual. An ought or shouldn't argument can always be made, granted sometimes for useful reasons, but also sometimes for shallow reasons. So, I'll be evaluating this issue through the lens of practicality. So, before I continue my examination, I must also profess that my reasoning and conclusions are all asserted with degrees of certainty. So, what is antinatalism exactly? Antinatalism is a philosophical position that assigns a negative value to birth. Antinatalists argue that people should refrain from procreation because it's morally bad. Some also recognize procreation of other sentient beings as morally bad, which means some antinatalists hold animals under the same moral standards as humans. Now, I'm going to stop right there, because that's not very reasonable to me. In the case of animals versus humans, one of the many functions of the prefrontal cortex is moderating social behavior. Not only is this region more developed in humans, 20% of the calories we consume are utilized by our brain. These conditions aren't present in the brains of animals. Their brains are inadequate in evaluating the failures of essentialism and anything we call ethics. Thus, I find it reasonable to conclude that it's a projection of morality, not a recognition. As it pertains to human life, and by way of a proposed moral framework, antinatalism facilitates the extinction of the human race through a self-induced entropy. As a starting point for accepting antinatalism, one must accept the following presuppositions. The first being that there's more harm than good, or the value of that said harm outweighs the benefit existence warrants, and the second being subjective value is quantifiable. There's more, however, I take issue with these, as they lend themselves to reasonable falsifiability. The nullification of harm is the keystone of the antinatalist philosophy, or equation if you like. Now, let me stop right here to clarify something. Obviously, I'm not referring to harm with informed consent. I mean harm in the conventional sense and context, as pain. In medical diagnosis, pain is regarded as a symptom of an underlying condition. Objectively, there are levels of pain ranging from mild to severe. That truth is evident in the subjective experience. And the logic holds true for the inverse. However, the antinatalist equation asserts pain is more valuable than the benefit of continued existence. In math, when comparing any two variables, one must ascertain a discrete quantity of value proportional in magnitude to what it represents. Strength of conviction isn't a reasonable metric for comparison in any rational equation. Quantifying and comparing an internally consistent measure of pain is easy. Contrasting the proposed value of that pain to the proposed value of continued existence is a matter of opinion. Thus, I conclude that it is a debate, not an equation. I find it mathematically plausible and indeed reasonable to instead calculate how many people are there alive, how much time is spent in a state of pain, and how long do they inflict that pain on other sentient beings, and then compare it to the amount of time people experience when these factors aren't present. Also, in the interest of dispelling confusion, I'm going to preemptively diffuse some reductio ad absurdum against my reasoning. In a conceivable future, an angry anonymous antinatalist might conclude that I'm treating all pain as if it's of the same value. Certainly murder is more severe than assault. It's only fair that the punishment fit the severity of the crime. Except, murder and assault are criminal actions with intent. Reproduction isn't. Hypothetically and retrospectively, it's unreasonable to regard Alois and Clara Hitler's reproduction as a criminally intended act facilitating the Holocaust. Hitler's fascist ideology amidst the backdrop of 3 decades of unresolved socioeconomic tensions were. This reverse scapegoating butterfly effect logic of karma is biblically dumb. Overwhelmingly in debates, I've observed that the most vocal antinatalists dismiss or willingly ignore all the time that we've spent in the absence of pain. Some of us have even used that time to help others, thus reducing the amount of time they experience pain. Indeed, if you're watching my high-minded examination, you're fortunate enough to have access to a computer with an internet connection. It's a statistically favorable wager that you, the viewer, probably live in a first-world nation. Now, consider carefully. Can you honestly say so far you've experienced more time in pain and causing pain in others than not? Also, if you've caused pain in others, that you lack the ability to reduce or prevent more of that pain in the future. I'm not appealing to an argument from incredulity, as feasible alternatives presently exist. You can reduce the amount of pain you cause by exercising the option to help others in need, or ask your doctor if veganism is a viable alternative for you. The human condition is not all doom and gloom. The capacity for improvement has been expressed, is what I'm trying to say. A frequently debated red herring that I'd like to examine is the assertion that your life has no lasting meaning when you die. Now, I'm going to stop right here and say that it doesn't have to have meaning to someone when they're alive and are able to appreciate it. Abraham Maslow rated self-transcendence as the lowest priority in his hierarchy of needs. The unpredictability of the future is beyond anybody's control. The only two things that are certain are that you'll never be able to impart anything worthy of notability if you don't try when you are alive and are able to. And the second thing is that there will always be the voice of dissent to that notability. Perhaps the most famous example is how people mocked Leonardo da Vinci for his failures, and still marginalize his legacy to this day. I find myself inclined to pontificate that beneath the ridicule, his critics envied and feared his potential because he challenged their pessimistic and narrow-minded complacencies. Whether one imparts notable legacy or not is of little comparison to imparting deprivation upon one in a dependent state. The conceivable inevitability of death, or rather the impact it has on those who leave behind, is worth some consideration. Before I continue, I'd like to restate that pertaining to reproduction in humans, moral absolutes are very contextual. Also, I'll be evaluating these quandaries through the lens of practicality. Since every person is born under different circumstances, there's no one objective solution on when to reproduce or abstain from reproduction. For instance, a potentially orphaned child with an inheritance of 100 grand can't reasonably be compared to a potentially orphaned child with no inheritance to speak of. So long as a person's actions are affecting another's, a moral argument can be made. Thus, I assert that reproduction can only be reasonably considered morally relevant while a child is in a state of dependence to that parent, and stops being morally relevant when the child achieves independence from that parent. It's because of this factor, my reasoning and considerations are inexorably biased towards entertaining as much favorable risk while the child is in its phase of dependence. It's a subjectively evident truth that, for an existing person, the absence of pain is a preferable state over the presence of pain. The factors that are most conducive to netting more time in the absence of pain are sufficient capital and reasonable availability of supply to satisfy demand. Equating human population planning to antinatalism is a dishonest semantic tactic. According to Wiki, human population planning is the practice of intentionally managing the rate of growth of a human population. Historically, human population planning has been implemented with the goal of increasing the rate of human population growth. However, in the period from the 1950s to the 1980s, concerns about global population growth and its effects on poverty, environmental degradation, and political stability led to efforts to reduce human population growth rates. More recently, some countries such as Iran and Spain have begun efforts to increase their birth rates once again. While population planning can involve measures that improve people's lives by giving them greater control of their reproduction, a few programs, most notably the Chinese government's one-child and two-child policy, have resorted to coercive measures. The artificial influence brought about by population planning is not without its repercussions, as historically disproportionate birth ratios from male to female have arisen. It's because of this that I find it reasonable to let this arrhythmia achieve some equilibrium before postulating with any degree of certainty that a population is predictably inflating or constricting. There's more to examine, but this seems to be a good stopping point for the time. Now, this can be seen as character assassination, but there's no way around it. There's an elephant in the room that's taking massive elephant-sized shits that simply must be addressed. I've heard that advocates of antinatalism have earned a reputation as being the most ravenously angsty, maliciously dysfunctional, anonymous, and outright rude community of parrots on the internet. So, I have a little homework for you. I want you to visit a channel promoting antinatalism. And then I want you to check the comments section of a few of their videos, and I'll let you make your own decision if it's a reputation well earned. Anyway, I've neglected my art long enough, and I'm sorry for not publishing more frequently. I assure you, I am still working and trying new things. With that said, utilize your time in Pain's absence to get out there and try to make something meaningful to other people. Thanks for watching.